coming and welcome. Hi, my name is Samira, and welcome to BDS101, where we will discuss the nuts and bolts about what BDS is. We and I are members of SUPER, and that's a student organization here at Huda dedicated to Palestinian justice. Hi, I'm Leah. SUPER began in 2012 in response to the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which we will be learning more today. And we support the nonviolent methods of BDS until Israel meets its obligation to the Palestinian people and complies with international law. SUPER understands that the struggle for Palestinian equal rights is entangled with global struggles around the world for economic and cultural and social justice. And we also stand in solidarity with local struggles combating injustice, and we condemn all forms of bigotry and hatred. So whether you know a little bit or a lot about BDS, hopefully you'll learn something new today and you can apply it to your everyday life. So also just to let you guys know that we are exhibiting posters and information on the back wall, so please be sure to check that out. It's information about current and historical boycotts that have occurred locally and globally. So just a little background on what BDS actually is. In 2005, the Palestinian Civil Society issued a call for a campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, to take, against Israel until it complies with international law and Palestinian rights by 1, ending the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall, and 2 is recognizing the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality, and 3 is respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. It truly is a global movement against Israeli apartheid and is rapidly emerging in response to this call. Today we are accompanied by a great panel who will take you through the basics of BDS, how they came to work around BDS and Palestine solidarity, and just provide you with facts about injustice going on in Palestine. So after, we will hold a discussion section where the panelists will be able to respond to each other. And lastly, we will hold a question and answer section where you will get to join the conversation. So the panel will get a chance to introduce themselves a little bit more in depth. But also just to let you guys know, quick note that we are taping this, but you guys will not be taped because it's just recorded. So we have our wonderful panelists, and we'll just provide some brief bios and then they can say a little bit more. We have Stefanie Fox, who is an organizer with Jewish Voice for Peace, and Stefanie will provide kind of the nuts and bolts of BDS. We have Huda Giddins, who is a Palestinian educator and the president of the Arab Center of Washington. We have Corrie, who is the mother of Evergreen student Rachel Corrie, who was killed by an Israeli bulldozer in 2003 while undertaking nonviolent direct action in Palestine. Corrie is the co-founder of the Rachel Corrie Foundation. And then last but not least, we have Hagopian, who teaches history at Garfield High School and is the Black Student Union advisor. And Jesse will discuss the recent Scrap the Map boycott, and he will connect local struggles to the global movement of BDS.
Thank you so much, SUPER, for inviting me and letting me be on this esteemed panel of fabulous, fabulous people that I admire. As was said, I'm Stefanie Fox. I'm the director of organizing at the national organization Jewish Voice for Peace that has a local chapter as well as chapters in 35 other cities and 130,000 members and supporters across the country. And I was delighted to be given the section of just giving a brief overview of sort of what are the nuts and bolts of BDS. We have a fabulous timekeeper here. I'm a chatter, so that may be necessary. But I love the work that SUPER is doing, and I'm really excited to hear who's in the room and to get to the Q&A as well. So I'm going to be brief and also hear from the rest of the panelists. When I'm thinking about why I personally feel moved and excited about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, I was thinking about a trip a few years back I took and spent some time in the West Bank inside Israel, and in particular a visit to Al-Araqib, a Palestinian Bedouin village in the south of Israel. And a gentleman I met there named Aziz. Now, Al Araqib is a Bedouin village that has been bulldozed. At the time I was there, something like 28 times in the last year, the year and a half prior to that. And since then, it's been in about 2.5 years, probably another 20 or 30 times since, just completely decimated. And it was devastating just to witness the destruction, let alone to have it, you know, for the folks in the village who had actually experienced their homes and communities and gardens and olive groves and lives being pulled up, literally uprooted by a caterpillar bulldozer and just torn to pieces. And we did this tour of the village that had, you know, you could see modern kitchen tile and cable dishes and you know, children's toys and the former place where bushes had been outside the front door, but it is all just turned to dust, to dirt. And you, right within the village, but right beyond the scene of massive destruction, were 100-year-old olive trees just in brambles, and there's this big compound of the IDF that is just packed with giant weaponized caterpillar bulldozers that would just, as we were taking a tour, just kind of drive by to whip up the dust in our faces a bit. And I remember Aziz, we were looking at particularly one of the oldest olive trees that had been in the village that had been just killed. And he was kneeling down by it, and we were talking about it, and beyond you could see this forest that has been planted by the Israeli government in cooperation with an organization called God TV, which is a Christian evangelical network in England. And it's this forest of just newly planted pine trees. And he said, you know, why is this 150-year-old tree dead and those brand new trees have been planted? All I can figure is this was an Arab tree, so it had to die. And as a Jew, the grief and horror that scene brought to me was profound. And the same was true in dozens of other places there, in stories I've heard for years, and in relationships I've had for years with folks affected directly. And for me, what the BDS movement is truly about is being able to say, those caterpillar bulldozers and the government that would requisition them in order to do this harm ought to be held accountable. And I actually don't have to just go home and lay in bed and cry about this, although I can also do that and did. But I actually can stand up, can take action, can be a part of a diverse and huge and growing community that is refusing to sit by and watch these kinds of atrocities happen. And so Amira pointed out already that's exactly what the 2005 call from broad base of Palestinian civil society did for us as internationals in community who have the capacity and the ability and the means to do this work. There was a call to us that said, please take up this work. And representing 3 rights-based demands, which is part of what I really love about the BDS call itself, is that it speaks to the 3 different geographically the 3 different parts of the Palestinian population in Israel, Palestine, and in the diaspora, calling attention to the need for full equality for the 20% of Israeli citizens who are Palestinian, of course calling an end to the endless settlement and colonization of Arab land in the West Bank and Gaza, and of course to calling upon the global community to respect, protect, and promote the rights laid out in UN 194, the resolution of the United Nations, that all refugees displaced in the kind of ethnic cleansing that has happened in Israel-Palestine be able to return to their homes. And it's so simple and elegant that these 3 rights inscribed in international law be made available through our work as international solidarity activists and allies. So just to break it down, because BDS, these are just initials we hear, and I'm a grassroots organizer. I've been organizing on multiple issues for many years. boycott, divestment, and sanctions are tactics, right? They're not specific campaigns. They're tactics that are time-honored. I mean, how many of you, just by raise of hands, can think of a time when boycott or divestment or sanctions have been used at another point in history to demand justice, demand change? Right? It's like all throughout time. You know, in Jewish history, we're very proud to think about, you know, on the Lower East Side, boycotts of kosher meat producers until the meat was brought to a fair price, led by Jewish women on the Lower East Side, right? There are movements in all of our histories that we can call on to be so proud of the use of these nonviolent tactics for change. And put very simply, boycott, divestment, and sanctions are all tactics that entail collective refusal to engage in particular economic relationships in order to demand change, right? So boycott is the individual form of that refusal. We have consumer boycott, which we'll often hear about specific companies like Hewlett-Packard, which actually produces the ID badges that all Palestinians are forced to carry around. That recently there was a suit saying to the High Court in Israel saying by a Palestinian Israeli saying that they wanted Israeli written on the passport because in fact they have Israeli citizenship, and it was refused because the system of law in Israel-Palestine is actually according to one's ethnic category, not according to one's citizenship. And so HP is actually the one producing that technology, and we of course know how HP exists here in our communities, and that's an opportunity for us as individuals or in various kinds of collectives to say, hey, we're gonna put some pressure on HP that they no longer employ these technologies there or in our own communities. Likewise, you hear about SodaStream is a settlement-produced fizzy water maker. I love some seltzer, but I don't want it to come with settlement. And here in Seattle, there's a fabulous campaign targeting Sur La Table, which was founded in the city of Seattle and has its headquarters here, to get them to de-shelve that. So those are examples of consumer boycotts. You also have cultural and academic boycotts, which are called for because of the intimate and inextricable and choiceful relationship between academic institutions inside Israel and the occupation. Who is producing the research and the technologies and the urban planning that outlines the architecture of the settlement industry or the occupation itself or the apartheid wall? That happens inside those institutions, and so they ought to also be held accountable. Then we have divestment, which is this institutional form of refusal, right? And that's when withdrawal of stocks or funds are made in order to hold accountable companies that are complicit in human rights violations. And then you have sanctions, the S, which is when you take that level of refusal to the state or global institutional level. You might hear for calls about ending unconditional military aid to Israel, and campaigns that are designed to do that. Sometimes at city council levels. There are calls from a wide coalition of interfaith leaders right now to Congress demanding that very thing, that says, hey, why is it that we have more unconditional money, billions of dollars headed to Israel in violation, when that money is being used in direct violation of not just international law, but indeed US law, right? Why is our money doing that? Why is our taxpayer dollars doing that? So that's what sanctions does. I just wanted to offer a quote by Alice Walker because I think for me it lays out sort of what really the moment is for us to take up with BDS and with these kinds of campaigns that are open for us. And she says, it's time for us, en masse, to show up in the front of our conscience and sit down in the front of the only bus we have, our own lives. What does that look like today? Support for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel to end the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, and by this effort to begin to soothe the pain and attend the sorrows of a people wrongly treated for generations. This action also reminds Israel we have seen it lose its way and have called to it, often with love, and not been heard. In fact, we've encountered often slander, insult, and too frequently bodily harm. And to me that encapsulates it perfectly, that we've tried everything, and this is our chance to actually hold the companies that are building this massive infrastructure of inequality and injustice, and to hold the state and our government accountable for these wrongs that are ultimately done in our names. Thanks.
I'm Giddins, and I'm Palestinian. Contrary to what many people think, because when you look at me, can you hear me in the back? No. Yes?
No.
Raised voice? Okay. They don't recognize me as an Arab. I've lived with this all my life, but I can't do more than what Stefanie has just done. She's just given you a very, very good picture of what BDS is all about. But what I would like to do is to tell you a little bit about my life. Life you'll hear about at this table. Anyway, my parents lived, and I, of course, and all our extended family lived in West Jerusalem, what is now West Jerusalem, but in my day, when I was growing up, it was all one city. I grew up under the British Mandate, which came into being after the First World War ended. And I remember very clearly that in school, all around us, our neighbors were a mixed bag of people. We had Muslims living close to us. I'm Christian. We had Muslims living close to us. We had Jewish people living close to us, and very good friends. I'm emphasizing the word very, very good friends. Our neighbor downstairs, I remember, was Dr. Drucker. Dr. Drucker was an orthodontist, and she became a very good friend of my family. And when it was time for my teeth to be straightened, my father, of course, had her be the doctor to straighten my teeth, which are not straightened. Never mind, that's another story. But she did a marvelous job. My teeth were all over the place, and she straightened them out. I have to tell you one little other story. One day, I had a canary, a bird that was in a cage, and we used to put him out on the balcony when it was sunny. One day I went to feed him, and the cage door was open, and there was no bird at all. I was demolished, because I really liked this little bird, and my mother kept saying, he'd come back, he'd come back, he'd come back, and I didn't know how he would know to come back. She said, just keep the cage door open. All right. About 3 days later, Dr. Drucker calls me downstairs to visit her. She says, Huda, come down, come down. So I went downstairs, and she said, I have a surprise for you. Here is your bird. To this day, I am moved by this. I'm sorry I'm tearing, but it was a very, very touching moment in my life. There came a time when, at the end of 1947, when we felt, the whole family felt it was the wise thing to do to leave Palestine, things became very bad. This was before the State of Israel was created. And what was happening was that there were Jewish armed militias that came into the country and were, in essence, terrorizing the Palestinians out of their homes. We had heard of massacres, we had heard of people who were driven out of their homes that they'd lived in for literally generations. And my family thought it was best to leave the country because, quote, it will all end in a short time and then we can go back. We're still waiting. That was in 1947, early 48. Israel was created as a state in May of 1948. I have been back. I have been back to live in Israel. And it's amazing. It felt a little bit as if I was going to a foreign country. I did also meet a lot of Jewish Israelis who called themselves proudly, I am a Palestinian Jew. It brought back a lot of memories for me because of what I just told you, that our life with Jews and Christians and Muslims was all interwoven. In fact, I didn't tell you that my father actually spoke Yiddish, and he was very proud of his knowledge of Yiddish and always sought out Jewish friends who knew Yiddish, with whom he could speak and share his whatever he knew with them. There was an attempt on the part of my father and uncles to be able to get our properties back. And the properties were houses, land, houses we lived in, and houses that were owned by the family, the different families, and land, a lot of land in different parts of Palestine. I still have a long, long, long list of these properties. We discovered that our property came under something that was called the absentee landlord law. So as soon as we left, our properties, our real estate, was immediately owned by the State of Israel because we were not there. Interesting phenomenon. I'm not surprised that there were Palestinians who were angry to the point of wanting to cause harm to Israeli Jews. And we have all heard a lot about the suicide bombings. We've not heard very much about what Israel has done in retaliation for these, and the loss of life, and the loss of home for a lot of Palestinians, still till today living in refugee camps in Lebanon, in Syria, by the way, and now they are refugees a second time over, in Jordan, in the West Bank, and in Gaza, which is locked up, by the way, in case you didn't know. I am more surprised and absolutely delighted that the Palestinian society, all of it, the civil society, has come together to create and to call for the BDS movement. And one of the people who was the founder of the BDS, one of the founders of the BDS movement, said to me, he said, you know, the BDS movement is not just a movement that reflects our Palestinian love for ourselves. It also reflects our love for Israel. We are just trying to say to Israel, stop what you're doing. Stop the occupation. Stop the imprisonment of the Gazans. Stop the illegal settlements. Stop it. So I want to leave you with that message, that the BDS movement is really about loving the Israelis as much as the Palestinians want it for themselves, want a solution for themselves. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, for hosting this important evening. Thank you to all of you for coming out on such a winter evening. It feels like winter has arrived for all of us. I think you're being here, I know for each of these panelists, but I think for all of you, you're here because you know this is a deeply important issue and you care deeply. I think all of us who work on this care deeply and are looking for some way to arrive at a constructive solution for the benefit of not only Palestinians and Israelis, but for all of us as well. And that's what brings me here this evening. I was asked to share a little bit about how I came to do this work. And so I just want to ask, how many people in here in the room know the story of Rachel Corrie? Most of you do. Are there people who are not familiar, very familiar with it? Most of you know. So a couple. Okay. So 11 years ago, at this time, my husband Craig and I were living in North Carolina. We knew we'd be coming back to the Pacific Northwest because Olympia was our home, but a job change had taken us to North Carolina. And my kids were grown. I had 3 children. They were grown. I'd always devoted a lot of time to them and to my community of Olympia. And I was enjoying the time in North Carolina. I'd walk every morning. I read more there during that time than I'd ever had time to read before. I was singing. I'm a musician, and I sang with the choir in Charlotte. It was great fun. And Craig and I, on the weekends, would take off to the Appalachians and hike in the mountains. And it was kind of like we had arrived almost, to our retirement or whatever. That we could see that opening for that in our lives. And then Rachel, my daughter, our youngest child, she was at Evergreen, an Evergreen student. She was very engaged with the community of Olympia. She had grown up there. She had lifelong friends there. Some people ask what took her to Gaza, because that's where she ended up. And it was really 9/11, and a lot of questioning that came out of that for her about why did this happen. She was supposed to fly to see Craig and me, to meet us on the East Coast, as right after 9/11 happened. And it was, I remember how disturbed she was about that whole experience, and how we all knew that our lives had changed irrevocably that day. So she went searching for answers. People in the Olympia community became, of course, very engaged in the peace movement in Olympia. While always there, you reemerged in a, of course, much larger way, as our response to all of that led to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then Rachel, in 2002, learned about the International Solidarity Movement, a movement co-founded by Jewish Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, Jewish Americans, Palestinian Americans. Founded because there had been a resolution in the United Nations to bring a human rights monitoring force to that region because of the violence that had erupted at the start of the Second Intifada in 2000. And that resolution was vetoed by the United States, supported by Israel. And as a result of that, ISM was founded to a call to bring internationals to the region to stand with Palestinians in nonviolent resistance to what was occurring in their lives. Rachel traveled. She very intentionally went to Gaza. She had a friend who had gone there earlier. She did a lot of research about Gaza. When I would come home to Olympia, she had checked out films from the Evergreen State Library for us to watch together. And that was my introduction to this issue, very much. Rachel was my introduction to the issue. Because I think our family, like a lot of families who didn't have direct connections there, if I had an allegiance at that time, it was very much to the Israeli Jewish narrative, which is what I knew and heard about most. And I read to my kids about the Holocaust, about Anne Frank, about all of those things. And so that's the place that I was coming from. So it was a bit uncomfortable, as I think it is for a lot of people who aren't too familiar with the narrative, to suddenly be drawn to look at this other piece of it, which is what Rachel asked me to do. And then she let us know that she was thinking very seriously about going to be a part of the International Solidarity Movement. She chose very specifically to go to Gaza, to Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip, because that's where she felt the greatest need was. And she studied Arabic before she left. She was very good at Arabic. Her teacher at Evergreen tried to convince her to wait a little longer, because he said if she just spent a little more time at it, she was ready to become very fluent. She had a real ear for languages. But she wanted to be there if the U.S. went to war with Iraq, thinking that eyes would be turned away from the Israeli-Palestinian issue if we were focused somewhere else, and that could pose particular dangers to the region. It didn't happen quite the way I think people anticipated, but in fact the situation became much worse in Israel-Palestine as a result of everything else that the U.S. was engaged with. So Rachel went there in 2003, in January of 2003. She was in Gaza for over 7 weeks, between 7 and 8 weeks. On March 16th, 2003, Craig and I in Charlotte, North Carolina, received a call that Rachel, about noon that day, actually it was from my son-in-law here in Olympia, with the news. And he said they had very sad news, and they had that Rachel had been killed. They actually confirmed it, read it running across the screen on television. Olympia woman killed in the Gaza Strip. And as I was on the phone with them, my son-in-law went back to the TV and saw Rachel Corrie killed in the Gaza Strip. And so that, of course, was a transforming moment for me. But fortunately, because of I think the wisdom and beauty of my daughter, and I see my time's going quickly, I have to jump fast, I had started to learn a lot. And I felt that I could be somewhat a voice for the messages that she was trying to share at that time. So that's how I came to do the work. How did I come to BDS? Very quickly. It's about solidarity for me. Being in solidarity with the Palestinian people. We've heard the call from Palestinian civil society in 2005 mentioned to the Palestinians who are in the West Bank and Gaza, to those that are citizens of Israel but are second-class citizens, and we've spent much time there. So I have a lot of experience meeting directly with these folks, and also with people like Huda who are here in the diaspora. But also solidarity with Jewish Israelis, with whom I have also spent a lot of time. And I've sat in rooms in Israel, in Haifa, and in different places talking with people there who tell me we cannot make the changes alone. We can't do it by ourselves. We need you to support this work. And organizations, I think it's important for you to know that there are organizations within Israel that support BDS, and we are standing in solidarity with them. I also have come to this point because I recognize our responsibility as U.S. citizens because of the amount of funding and because we have a special relationship with Israel that in many ways I think does a great deal of damage to Israel, to the Palestinians, but also to our relationships with the rest of the world. Very quickly, let me tell you that I'm tired because we've spent a lot of time trying to bring out of Gaza a young man who's going to spend 3 months with us in Olympia with a new program of the Corrie Foundation Leadership Studies Fellowship. And it's taken months for him to get from Gaza to Cairo for visa appointments, to get his to be able to have those coincide, and then to get from Cairo to the U.S. But he made it early Monday morning. So we've been very focused on that. But he told me about something just yesterday, that Russia and the Egyptians are talking about military bases in Egypt. And his response was that the U.S. is in such decline that this is now possible. And I thought that it was, I just thought it was an interesting insight, not unlike a lot of others that we hear as we're traveling around the world, about what is happening because people view us as being too biased in this situation, not contributing to a solution there. We've been very involved with Caterpillar. Perhaps in the Q&A I can talk to you about that a little bit more. Caterpillar is one corporation, but it's very complicit. It's been a symbol of the occupation because how it's been used to destroy homes, to raise land and olive orchards, for settlements, for Jewish-only roads in the area, for the wall in the West Bank. And Caterpillar is on notice. I know that because I've been to their shareholders meeting, I've written letters, I've been in Peoria, Illinois. And so it's one place that we can focus some attention. I think I'll just stop there and say that there's a memorial at Evergreen that just this past week was dedicated to Rachel. Some of the students here in the room and the faculty and a wonderful artist in our community, Ross Madison, worked very hard to make that happen, and it was dedicated this past week. It's a triangular pyramid, steel pyramid, and on the top is a beautiful dove that Ross has sculpted. And the beauty of it, I think, is that people say when you walk up to it, you expect to read something about Rachel. It says, reflections on peace and justice, and then Rachel Corrie and the dates of her life. But when you get up to that pyramid and you look at it, what you see is not Rachel, but you see yourself. And it's a reminder that this is an important time for all of us to take action. We think BDS is a proactive, nonviolent way to do this, and our allies in Israel and Palestine are asking us to join them. Thank you.
I want to thank you guys for the work that you do day in and day out. to stand for Palestinian justice, and I guess it's was especially moving for me to hear from Huda and hear about the Nakba, something that you can't learn about in Israeli schools, from a law recently passed in the Knesset. And then if you listen to, say, Newt Gingrich, who calls Palestinian people an invented people, right? It's amazing just to have someone, right, claim their identity. And you know, John Kerry and his ongoing mission right now is trying to broker a peace in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. And he said yesterday that the Israeli settlements were, quote, illegitimate, right? He called them illegitimate. He stopped short of calling them illegal, but he called them illegitimate. But then, of course, at the end of his speech, he said it would be much better if they limited the settlements as much as possible, right? This is the kind of direct contradiction, doublespeak that we get from our government and from the Obama administration, unfortunately. But I think Barack Obama notwithstanding, that Black Americans have a proud, long tradition of opposing Israeli apartheid. And I want to talk a little bit about that and my experience going to Israel and Palestine, because you know, the Civil Rights Movement and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the backbones of the Civil Rights Movement, the sit-ins in the South fighting against Jim Crow segregation, released a statement in 1969 condemning the state of Israel and the Zionist policies that were carried out against Palestinians. And it's in that tradition that I joined the first historic delegation of African Americans in the Interfaith Peace Builders trip in 2011. And I joined with veterans of the Black freedom struggle here in the United States, of the Civil Rights Movement, many from the South who had participated in a lot of the struggles that brought down Jim Crow segregation. And it was an incredible experience to see not only an occupation and all the brutality that comes with, but to see that through the eyes of people who had lived under segregation and could name that and identify it in their own lives. So we first saw it leaving the airport and going on segregated roads and passing segregated schools, right? Things that were very familiar to my colleagues, some of whom were in their 70s on this delegation. And seeing the textbooks that deny that Huda's experience happened, right? That cannot refer to a Nakba. And seeing the segregation wall, right? And we had a chance to travel to Berlin, where we saw a group of activists there who had scored one of the first victories against that wall in the history, in history. And they said it was an incredibly emotional moment as they reached out to people that they had never met, African Americans that said had inspired them from the Civil Rights Movement to do direct action, nonviolent tactics to actually challenge the illegality of the wall and the settlements and score a victory against it. And then we met with settlers in Hebron. And our delegation went there and met with a man who had helped oversee the dispossession of Palestinians from their homes, right? Sometimes at gunpoint, and heard that this was his historic homeland, and so he had the right to kick people out of their homes. Then we went and met with people who had been kicked out of their homes, and what we didn't know is when we were meeting in that settlement, that right down below are all the Palestinian shops. And going through those shops and seeing the places where acid had been poured down on Palestinians, or different weapons had been thrown, was a truly moving experience. But I think the one thing that stays with me the most from our travel there was afternoon we spent with Palestinian civil society activists not committed to nonviolence. And we got to spend an afternoon with them talking about how they are building the BDS movement, how they're building other forms of direct action nonviolence. And one of our delegates, Gloria, was in her late 60s or early 70s. And she told her story to these Palestinian activists. And she began by explaining that she was a school teacher in Mississippi. And she taught in an all-black segregated school. And when Brown versus Board of Education passed, saying that schools had to be desegregated in 1954, she and other activists from the NAACP wanted to challenge the segregated school system. And as she's explaining this story, somebody busts into the room and says, one of the oldest olive trees in all of the West Bank is going to be bulldozed, and we have to do something right now. And so many of the Palestinian activists had to leave, jumped up and left, and went off to work on trying to defend this tree from being bulldozed. And we had limited time, and Gloria continued her story with the activists who stayed behind. And she said, we went to challenge it in the courts, but it was going too slow, so we began to go straight to the school board, and we demanded of the superintendent that they allow us to begin teaching in that all-white school. And when he refused, we organized a delegation to go and march. And finally, the courts came through with a lot of pressure and demanded the desegregation of that school. And she went to show up for her first day of work, and it was surrounded by the Ku Klux Klan, and she couldn't get in. And she went, and they were up on horseback with shotguns. And then she went back the next day and the next day, and she couldn't get in. And it took building a mass march of people being able to surround the school, of black and white activists refusing to be intimidated by the Klan before they finally were chased out and she was allowed to begin teaching there. And she said, what I've seen here in Israel is that your opposition doesn't even hide their face in sheets. They are so much more terrifying because they walk around with complete immunity. And the Palestinian activists that we were working with were just in tears, hearing that you can win and that people around the world have built solidarity movements and struggled and won. And our last experience I want to share with you was that we went to an illegal book reading in the only democracy in the Middle East. We went to an illegal book reading because this book reading was of the book BDS that was put out by Omar Barghouti. And if you advocate for boycott, divestment, and sanctions in Israel, it's illegal, and you can be held liable. And if it's found that you cost any corporation any money, then you can be held responsible for that money. But Omar's a very courageous man, and we went and heard him speak. And again, the connection to our own struggle was made as he described a Palestinian village that had been destroyed in the Nakba, and now they were planting a forest over it that they called Coretta Scott King Forest, right? And this is the type of whitewashing, or I guess you could say blackwashing, of the crimes of Israel that goes on to cover up atrocities that we've seen there. I'll just end by saying that I had a chance to see firsthand the power of a boycott. I was inspired by reading about and teaching about the civil rights movement. And this past year at Garfield High School, all the teachers at the school refused to give a standardized test that was wasting our children's time, narrowing the curriculum, disrespecting our English language learners' cultural and linguistic diversity, and had a whole lot of problems. And when we stood strong, we were threatened with a 10-day suspension without pay, and nobody backed down. And at the end of the year, they canceled the test, and we don't have to give it anymore. It's not being administered this year. So it's really, to me, showed the power of a boycott. And in the middle of our own boycott against the MAP test, I got called from someone on our delegation that was on the African Heritage delegation saying that Stevie Wonder was about to play a concert for the IDF in California. And we had to have a response. And so I just want to end by reading you the letter we sent to Stevie Wonder. It says, Stevie, you were arrested in 1985 protesting South African apartheid. Now we ask you, please remember that apartheid is apartheid, whether it comes from white Afrikaner settlers of South Africa or from Jewish Israelis in Israel. And Desmond Tutu has recognized that Israelis' apartheid is worse than South Africa's. Will you stand with us against apartheid and cancel your performance at the IDF fundraiser? And I'm proud to say that Stevie Wonder, under pressure from a whole lot of different groups, who has long been a champion for social justice, realized it. He said, as a messenger of peace, I can't play for the IDF, the people who killed Rachel Corrie. And I'm proud to say that this movement has scored many victories, and I think we're at the very beginning of what can become a truly effective and mass boycott movement.
Thank you for your words. Now we will hold a brief discussion section for panelists to respond to each other. So just to get things started, me and I will throw in a prompt, and you guys will get a chance to respond to each other. So here is our first prompt. In your experience, how can boycott help inform communities and be a tool for education and for beginning difficult conversations? It's often been argued that BDS shuts down dialogue, but that's not what we heard this evening. Can you all elaborate instances and examples would be appreciated?
I think, Jesse, the example you used of the boycott of the map is perfect, because I can only imagine and would love to hear more about what an education for the students, right? And I think the same has been true of every BDS campaign I've seen. I think what we often say in JVP is, it's not just the win of like getting the product deshelved or the school passing a resolution, but whenever there is daylight on discussion of what is happening in Israel-Palestine, that's a victory. Because the truth is, it's hiding the facts where we lose our ability to talk to one another, right? Where it's when discussions are shut down and said this can't happen, we're scared of this conversation happening, we're challenged by this conversation happening. That's really holding ourselves and our communities back. It's really saying that we don't trust ourselves to engage in deep work with each other to really understand what's happening in the world. And I think every campaign I've seen happen, I work with students at campuses all over the country, and every time a resolution comes or a campaign happens on their campus, to see the students come alive with conversation with each other, with looking at the facts, with understanding the ways in which technologies that, it turns out that injustice is a pretty global enterprise. You might be surprised to realize it happens the world over, and that these corporations are inextricably linked to each other. It wasn't just the example of the wall I used, or of HP also working on biometric scanning that they can use in Israel-Palestine, that they also are offering to border enforcers here in the US. But it's Elbit, an Israeli company that is one of the world's largest drone manufacturers, and those drones are being used the world over. And so there's a very fluid exchange of these technologies and of these notions of how to dominate and contain populations that are inconvenient. But there is a very strong pull to not let that same free exchange happen about ideas and truth. And so I happen to think that it's a good notion when we let it.
Yeah, I agree. I always had hoped that I would see the power of a boycott, and grew up on stories of the Montgomery bus boycott and how that launched the civil rights movement. And to see the students, when the superintendent in the Seattle Public Schools said, well, if you're going to refuse to give the test, then we're going to force the administration to pull these kids out of your class and lock them down in the computer lab. And then the students refused to get out of their seat and staged a sit-in in their own classroom. And it did. It brought the whole community together. It made us really think about what is education about, what should we be learning, how can education be about liberation. And when we took our stand, it wasn't just that we defeated the test for Garfield or for the city of Seattle, but people all across the country by the thousands began not only sending us letters of solidarity, but starting their own boycotts against tests, saying, why are we spending hundreds of millions of dollars on testing when we could use that money for reading coaches or for after-school tutors, and the things that can enrich education. And I think the same lessons can be drawn out around BDS. I think that when we take a stand and show the power of this work to bring about justice, that other people will be inspired by these lessons and both join the BDS movement, but also stand up for their own causes and their own localities. And I think this campus is ripe to do this work. And it's had some incredible victories, TIA, CREF, divesting, and the list keeps growing every day of artists who are refusing to perform in Israel and raising awareness that way. And I think that a strong movement here on this campus could go a long way.
Anyone else want to respond?
I would just add, I was in Israel at the time that the Olympia Food Co-op made the decision to take Israeli products from their shelves. It was interesting because it was reported, it got press, of course, in Israeli newspapers. And this was, I think, the first grocery to do such a thing. So, but there was a lot of attention to it there. But in our own community, there's some people in the room who worked very actively on making that happen and continue to work with it. What I heard from people, because I wasn't there to experience it myself, but was that it created this opportunity to talk about these issues in a deeper way than people had seen happen since Rachel was killed in 2003. When Rachel was killed was another moment when there were a series of people that were brought in to do lectures and that kind of thing. But here we were with the food co-op boycott was 2010. So 7 years later, and everyone felt it just raised the level of conversation and discussion. Not easy discussion all the time, but very important discussion to have. And it continues in our community. That boycott is in place. But people want to make sure that it remains. Not everybody wants to make sure that it remains. So the discussion about that, and from our point of view, why it should continue, and why we should be making sure that people are within the co-op who are going to be making decisions, why we need to know what their position is on the boycott, why that's all important. That's part of our community discussion right now. So yeah, I think for us at least, it's proved not only, not at the moment of the boycott, but for years after to be an impetus really for more exploration of all these important questions.
And what I'd like to add, with great affirmation, is that there are many, many, many Jews, both here and in Israel, who are very unhappy, angry, I might say, in some instances, with what the Israeli government policies are. Some of these Jewish people in Israel, and I'm deliberately identifying, because as Stefanie said, one-fifth of the Israeli population is actually Palestinian Arabs. But I'm specifically focusing on the Jewish Israelis. Some of them are, and it is a growing number, both within the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, that Jesse mentioned, and the civilian society, that are really, really quite unhappy with the occupation that is perpetuated by the government of Israel. There's a lot of writing going on, there's a lot of filmmaking going on, and I think you all need to know this. You all need to know that there are, from within the Jewish congregations, there are those who disapprove of what is happening because it runs against their moral, ethical beliefs. And they join forces with Palestinians when Palestinians nowadays are protesting non-violently. So I just have to make this point. And there are many, many Jewish people here in the United States who are quite outspoken and quite bold about their disapproval, their dismay, their anger with the Israeli government and what it is perpetuating and doing to the Palestinians in the West Bank.
Thank you all for your responses and everything that you have shared with us tonight.